Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of Live with NORML. I'm JM Pedini, the Development Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Today we will be having an amazing conversation, not only with you all, but with NORML staffers Paul Armentano, the Deputy Director of NORML, and Morgan Fox, our Political Director. We're going to talk about the 2024 presidential candidates and their positions and evolutions on cannabis policy. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. It's July 30th, July 31st. I am having the worst trouble remembering what today is, last week and today. Hey, hit that like, follow, or subscribe button wherever you're watching so you never miss when NORML goes live. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments right now. We can see your comments, and we are here and excited to answer all of your burning questions today about the presidential candidates. You can join us on Friday for our regular Live with NORML, and we'll answer even more questions for you, I promise. Let's get started. Hey, Samuel in North Carolina. Hey, Kathy in Connecticut. I know, Christopher, it is Wednesday. Isn't this weird? Hey, Corey, watching on Instagram in Texas, and Sonia in LA, Dexy in Buffalo, Sean in Maryland. Hey, Nick, welcome back. Hi, Chris. All right, friends. I know you're going to have a lot of questions, and so I'm going to bring in our two NORML staffers to talk about what we're going to talk about. First, let's add Paul, and let's go ahead and add Morgan at the same time. Are you ready, Morgan? If not, I'm going to remove you. There you are.
Hey, everybody.
All right, so hey, Paul, why don't you go ahead and quickly introduce yourself and tell us what you're going to talk about.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to answer questions from the audience. I'm Paul Armentano. I'm NORML's Deputy Director, as I'm sure most of you know, and I've been working on cannabis policy reform for nearly 3 decades. And I'm excited to talk with all of you about this upcoming election, where some of the candidates stand on these issues, and what the election outcome, what sort of implications it could have for marijuana policy reform going forward, and or reclassifying marijuana at the federal level.
Awesome. And which candidate will you be covering today, Paul?
I'll be talking about Kamala Harris's evolution and her record as District Attorney, Attorney General, U.S. Senator, and Vice President.
Awesome. And hey, Morgan.
Hi, I'm Morgan Fox. I'm NORML's Political Director. Very happy to be here with you all today. I'm going to be going into some of the history and politics surrounding the Trump administration's position on these issues, and some of the things that we can expect going forward, depending on the outcome of the next election. Also, just do want to clarify for the viewers that NORML is not taking any sort of a position or endorsement in the presidential elections. We merely want to show what the positions are of various candidates and let voters decide for themselves.
Fantastic. Who wants to go first?
I'll certainly begin the conversation. You know, as many folks know, I lived in California for about 15, 16 years. And that was during the time Kamala Harris was District Attorney while she was Attorney General, and while she was a U.S. Senator. So this is somebody that I have personal familiarity with as a voter and as a resident, and certainly somebody professionally that I've paid attention to for quite some time. Like many Americans, Kamala Harris's position on cannabis has really evolved over time, and it's progressed over time. You know, if you go back 20 years or so, particularly when she was the district attorney for the city of San Francisco, this was somebody who was fairly outspoken in favor of protecting patients' access to medical marijuana, protecting at the local level the ability of cultivators and providers to dispense medical cannabis, and actually did so at a time when the federal government was cracking down in states like California and elsewhere on the rights of medical marijuana patients. That was her position as DA. She was very public about it, but she was not somebody at that time who favored legalization beyond just medical access. And again, that wasn't uncommon, even in California. Right up until 2010, fewer than half of all Californians supported legalization. And in fact, there was a ballot initiative in 2010 that failed in California because most Californians at that time were not ready to make that leap. Either was Kamala Harris. But in 2016, California did choose to legalize the adult use of marijuana. And that coincided with Ms. Harris being the Attorney General for California, and with her views on this, with her attitudes with respect to marijuana policy changing dramatically. By the time she was elected senator in the US Senate in 2019, she sponsored legalization legislation in the Senate. She sponsored the Senate's version of the MORE Act, which would declassify cannabis or remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. So at that point, she was publicly supporting legalization of cannabis. And as the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, this will be the first time in our history where we've had one of the candidates from one of the two parties for presidency ever having been an outspoken supporter of legalization in their history.
Let's try that again. Thanks, Paul. I shared some recent media coverage that NORML is quoted in regarding the evolution of Vice President Harris's cannabis policy positions, as well as your recent op-ed in Other Words, the first major presidential candidate to support marijuana legalization. We're still seeing a lot of comments. I see your comments on Instagram, people talking about Vice President Harris's past record when she was district attorney in California. Can you talk about her evolution a bit more and why that matters so much to us at NORML?
Sure, absolutely. Just to clarify, she was district attorney for San Francisco. She was the attorney general for the state of California. So when she was district attorney of San Francisco, obviously she had quite a bit of discretion when it came to what charges to bring and what charges not to bring. And as noted, at that time, she was very clear that she was not going to bring charges against individuals who used cannabis for medicinal purposes, and she was not going to bring charges against dispensaries who were providing medical cannabis. And she lived up to that agreement. In fact, Kamala Harris was well supported in the medical cannabis community in the Bay Area at that time, and that community continued to support her when she ran for Attorney General in the state of California, I believe in 2010. And at that time, she was actually running against another candidate for Attorney General who had taken a much more confrontational and oppositional stance against medical marijuana patients at that time. So again, this was somebody who had the support of the medical cannabis community, but who also admitted that the broader issue of legalization was personally not her issue. That became her issue later over time in the ensuing years after California legalized marijuana for adult use. I think like many Americans, once exposed to the real world realities of legalization, and that legalization works and is preferable to a policy of criminalization, that influenced Ms. Harris in going from a legalization skeptic to a legalization proponent. And as I say in my recent op-ed, That's the trajectory the majority of Americans in this country have taken. If we go back 10, 15 years, less than 50% of America supported legalization. Today, that stands at 70%. So she's not the only one who has evolved on this issue over the last decade. The majority of America has as well.
And that's what we do here at NORML. Those are the resources we provide to our members, to our subscribers, to our visitors. We give you tools to contact your elected officials in support of cannabis policy reform and provide you with resources to help change their mind. And as we talk about every week on this show, when people do change their mind, first of all, we congratulate ourselves for being really effective and persuasive. And then second, we welcome them over to the right side of history. So what do they change their minds? That's what we are here to help you all do. Now, I do see some more comments, some more questions, Paul, on Instagram in particular about what Vice President Harris has done recently when it comes to cannabis policy. And while we may have touched on this briefly, could you talk about NORML's recent visit to the White House with Vice President Harris?
Sure. So as many folks know, this administration has taken a couple steps using its executive powers to try to influence marijuana policy. Now, obviously, it's Congress who voted to prohibit cannabis via its Schedule 1 status in the Controlled Substances Act, and ultimately it is Congress that has to reform federal statutes with respect to marijuana. The president can't do that, but the president does have executive powers, and this administration has utilized some of them. One, the administration launched a rescheduling petition that remains ongoing, but that has recommended thus far that marijuana be removed from Schedule 1 and moved to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. The president has also on 2 occasions issued pardon proclamations for those with low-level federal marijuana possession arrests. Those are not expungements. Neither the president nor a governor has the ability to provide expungements. Only the courts can, but the president and governors of states can issue pardons. And this is the first administration where the president has ever used that pardon power to grant some pardon relief to those with marijuana convictions.
All right, look at that. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul, so much for going over Vice President Harris's cannabis policy positions as well as her evolution over these many years. Morgan, are you ready? Because you're up next.
I sure am. If we're going to talk about the primary Republican challenger in this election, we really have to recognize that this so far seems like a relatively low priority issue for former President Trump, and his actions regarding things that impact cannabis policy reform and cannabis consumers have been a little bit schizophrenic. I think that we can start on some of the bad stuff and then move into some of the good stuff. So I think right away, we need to talk about the fact that his appointment as Attorney General initially was Jeff Sessions, who was an avowed prohibitionist, and within months of taking office, rescinded the Cole memo, which had created a policy guideline internally within the Department of Justice to prevent federal prosecutors from going after state legal operators across the country and in a growing number of states. Despite the fact that the Attorney General at that time rescinded this rule, we did not see a lot of any sort of a crackdown when it came to actually enforcing those laws, absent the official memo and policy guideline, which I think to me really says that federal prosecutors recognize that using resources in this fashion was a complete waste of time. They had already developed protocols based on state legal cannabis systems, and were not really willing to go back on that. This is also not necessarily a hill that Jeff Sessions really wanted to die on. We saw his predecessor, Bill Barr, again reiterate the de facto policy of not really prioritizing cannabis policy enforcement or cannabis illegality enforcement in states that had legalized cannabis for medical or adult use. But at the same time, it was certainly not as strong-throated, and we definitely saw a lot of really negative comments from Bill Barr during the course of his time in the administration. We also saw that as another indicator that this was a relatively low priority issue for then President Trump, the appointment to very high level ONDCP offices, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, of campaign staffers with no experience who were in their early 20s. I think, again, this is a really good indication that this was not top of mind. Former President Trump has stated on multiple occasions things such as legalization is a good idea. He's also said that it's a bad idea. It really depends on who he's talking to and what his audience is for any given statement. Some of the things that are solid and verifiable that we have seen in the positive is that he granted clemency for a number of people that were convicted of marijuana violations towards the end of his term. At the same time, he was also explicitly calling for an institution of the death penalty for drug dealers at the federal level. And when asked about the fact that people that he had just granted clemency to potentially facing the death penalty under such a policy, he, for the most part, prevaricated and did not really give much of a response other than that had there been a death penalty in place, the person that he granted clemency to wouldn't have needed clemency in the first place because they would not have engaged in that activity. We all know that severity of punishment is not a deterrent for crime. All the research backs that up. So I think that there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But also, I think that there's a pretty serious disconnect between calling for incredibly harsh punishments, but also granting clemency to people that would fall under those punishments. So again, I think this is another indication that it really depends on the audience and on the political viability of any particular move when it comes to determining what a future President Trump would do in the White House when it comes to cannabis. Again, when he has prohibitionist audiences, he has focused on the tenuous and so far unproven links between cannabis use and mental illness and cannabis use and mass violence. These things generally tend to get a lot of headlines, but are actually not supported by the science in any way, shape, or form to this point. I think that when we're looking at the history of President Trump's positions on cannabis policy reform, it's very difficult to really pin it down, both in terms of what it actually meant at the time, but also what it could mean for the future. This really, I think, does come down to an issue where he really does not care that much about it beyond where it starts to impact politics as opposed to policy.
All right. Does anybody have any questions? I see some comments. I don't really see any questions for Morgan when it comes to former President Trump and his positions on cannabis policy.
I should note that a majority of Republicans now support legalization at the federal level. So that might be a reason why we are not seeing a lot of vitriol out of this. Typically during an election season, when a Democratic or even regardless of any, when one member of a single party is campaigning on a particular issue, as Vice President Harris certainly is on the accomplishments of the administration in terms of cannabis policy reform. Generally, during an election year, we see an automatic knee-jerk contrarian reaction from folks on the other side of the aisle. I think it's pretty interesting that rather than doing that yet, this is still early days, but the most recent statements that I've seen have not been, or from the Trump administration and from the Trump campaign, have not been to attack Vice President Harris for her positions on this issue in terms of cannabis policy reform, but rather to attack her record as a prosecutor, to say that she's really not as good as she is portraying herself on this issue. I think that is a very, very telling point when we're looking at this issue from a political standpoint.
And Morgan, you mentioned that a majority of Republicans now support ending cannabis prohibition. You meant Republican voters, of course.
Indeed.
And
Yeah.
that segues nicely into Nick's question. Nick is a regular watcher of Live with NORML, and we have often discussed on this show that the way in which federal prohibition will end is by Congress passing a bill that removes marijuana from the Federal Controlled Substances Act, allows states to set their own policies without threat of federal interference. Now, what happens if such a bill gets to a President Trump desk? Nick asks, would he sign it?
I think it's impossible to tell, and depends entirely upon the political environment at the time that it arrives at his desk. I think it also depends largely on who the lead sponsors are, how much it is considered a Republican-led bill versus a bipartisan bill versus a democratically led bill. I think that because Trump's position on this issue is kind of all over the place, it's almost impossible to predict exactly what would happen if decisions are placed directly in his lap. What I do think we need to be concerned about is the people that both of these candidates are surrounding themselves with. People that will likely be appointed to very high positions of power that will be both the gatekeepers of such policy, but also be able to heavily influence the way that either president decides on many of these issues. Whether or not they sign bills, whether or not they prioritize the issue, whether or not they are being proactive in working to undo the harms caused by prohibition through various measures. So I think that it is really important to, in the vacuum of a cohesive policy position, look at the people that are going to likely be in charge of making those initial decisions. And I don't think that it would be a surprise to anybody to realize that in the Trump administration, there are going to be a lot of anti-cannabis people involved. From looking at his previous appointments to attorneys general to looking at the close ties with many members of his staff and campaign and previous administration to folks like the Heritage Foundation, which are avowed prohibitionists, despite sitting back and drinking their scotch while they're talking about how terrible cannabis is. The list goes on and on. I think that in a Harris administration, we're probably going to be looking at people in powerful agency positions and close advisors that are going to be, or at least already have been, much more supportive of cannabis policy reform in the right direction than in a Trump administration, just based on what we've seen in the past. We still on?
We are. We're having some internet stability issues, which of course we don't control. Let me, Christopher will let us know when we're unfrozen. He's our in the field producer every week. So Christopher also has a question here, and I think that's valid. I see a number of like this from people who are experiencing the weight of more conservative administrations in their home states, and they're concerned about then how that would similarly translate under a Trump administration.
I mean, again, I think it's very difficult to tell. While the executive does have a significant amount of power to direct and shape legislation, at the end of the day, Congress is responsible for all of that. So I think beyond the presidential election, the makeup of Congress in the 119th is going to be very important in terms of figuring out exactly how much airspace we're going to have for being able to run bills, and what sort of priority will be placed on them. Now, Republicans and Democrats alike are not great about prioritizing these bills. Democrats are maybe slightly better, but across the board, these bills are a relatively low priority. So I think that smart politicians will start to prioritize them as a way to both raise their own profile, but also because it's the right thing to do, and the vast majority of the bills that are currently being considered and that are likely to be introduced in the next session are largely bipartisan, largely revenue neutral, or at least revenue light, and are directly helping people that have very, very clear harms caused by current federal criminalization. So these are all just a series of bills that can help take the most vulnerable members of society off of the battlefield of the war on drugs, and this is something that people from both parties can support. The question is, are they going to make time for them on committee schedules? Are they going to make time for them for floor votes? Are they going to allow them to progress whatsoever? I mean, we've seen right now that the House is basically in a state of total dysfunction. The Senate seems to be a little bit more functional, but is again in such a tight deadlock that it's very difficult to get anything done other than what they absolutely need to do in order to avoid a government shutdown. So I think that whoever is in the White House in the next term is going to be able to apply pressure on both Congress as well as federal agencies to start addressing this. But we really need to look at the records of both candidates and how much they've prioritized this issue in their public statements, in their actual actions, to really look at or get an idea about how much these sort of things might be prioritized under their administration. Clearly, Congress can prioritize them in different ways, but they are definitely both in a partisan sense, but also in terms of the legislative body as a whole, heavily affected by the direction that the White House wants to go.
And Anne asks a very important question. She'd like to know about J.D. Vance.
Well, I mean, Vance is sort of another chameleon on this issue. It's very difficult to pin down his position. He's made a variety of statements across the board. And that makes it very difficult to pin down where he would be as vice president. Again, I think that this would be an issue of priority setting based on Trump's presidential priorities and his edicts about exactly how far a Vice President Vance would go in addressing these issues.
Let's go ahead and bring Paul back to join us as well. Now, friends who've been listening for a while have heard Paul talk about Vice President Harris's positions on cannabis policy, as well as her evolution over her many years in public office. And Morgan just discussed former President Trump's positions and statements on cannabis policy, and to what degree it's a priority for him. You've said it doesn't really appear to be a priority for him. Paul, what do you think for Vice President Harris when it comes to the priority she might place on cannabis policy?
That's a great question. I think the answer to that question is going to depend on a number of issues, including, what are other priority issues at that time that are in competition for gathering some of the oxygen in the room on Capitol Hill. Again, I will say this, as a first-term junior U.S. Senator from California, Kamala Harris was the lead sponsor of legislation to declassify cannabis from the Federal Controlled Substances Act, essentially making this a state issue and not a federal issue. I think that does speak to the fact that certainly, at least at that point in time, this was a fairly high priority issue for her as a lawmaker. In that, again, she wasn't just willing to co-sponsor this bill or to give it lip service. She was, in fact, the bill.
Yeah, and I would just follow up with that and just point to the fact that the Harris campaign right now is actively campaigning on this issue. So, while that doesn't necessarily translate into policy priorities, it certainly means that it's on the radar and also provides advocates with a way to hold a future Harris administration's feet to the fire and make sure that they actually follow through on the rhetoric that they've been using in order to help gain support for the policies that Vice President Harris has absolutely been pushing to the extent of her ability in that office.
Yeah, I'd also say this. When you mentioned earlier, Morgan, that roughly 50% or slightly more than 50% of Republican voters support legalization. When you break this down politically among Democrats, about 75% or 80% of registered Democrats say they support legalization. So, supporting this issue for whoever's on the Democratic ticket is simply good politics for them as well. Now, in this case, I do think that Vice President Harris does truly believe in this position, and again, had taken up this position some years ago. But for anyone seeking the nomination or the presidency running on the Democratic ticket, it would seem absurd to take any position other than a strident support for legalization, because that's what their base supports.
I mean, honestly, I think it's absurd for anybody in the GOP to be fighting against this. I mean, there are plenty of swing voters out there that could be drawn into the GOP voting pool with stronger positions on cannabis policy reform. And I think that, as of right now, Republicans don't necessarily face the same sort of political consequences that Democrats do for being on the wrong side of this issue, but they're going to start, and real soon. This is a way for Republicans to really stand out from the crowd of the rest of their peers by focusing and prioritizing this issue in a way that younger voters respond to, and in a way that will help them build much broader, big umbrella coalitions among both, various advocacy organizations, with other lawmakers, with folks on both sides of the aisle, with third-party candidates. It really just is an issue of prioritization, and there we get into the issue of prioritization for voters. I've always said that cannabis policy reform support is a mile wide but an inch deep. Even the most hardcore supporters of legalization, it's usually 5, if not 10 items down on their list of priority political and policy issues. And that's what we need to change. And I think that lawmakers and elected officials that are looking ahead and responding to that and seeing the trend that even the most recent polling has shown that this is becoming a more priority issue for voters, even if that isn't translating to lawmakers. If lawmakers are hearing enough from voters about this, we're going to start to see a lot more action in this field. We're going to start to see a lot more insistence that these bills be brought up for hearings. We're going to see a lot more dedicated focus on the parts of administration and agency heads to address some of the problems that people are bringing up. But it really depends on all you folks out there contacting your lawmakers and contacting your other electeds.
All right, friends, we have just a few more minutes left in today's live with Morgan and Paul. I see a few comments here. Lauren says, thanks for educating us on this issue. Lauren, you're welcome. Thanks for joining us on a Wednesday afternoon to discuss the cannabis policy positions of the 2024 presumptive presidential candidates. And Nick asks a pretty interesting question here. I don't know about that one, Nick, but let's go with the first part here. Nick asked, "Do we have a better chance for legalization and or descheduling?"
So interestingly, we haven't really talked about some of the people on the short list for potentially being Kamala Harris's VP. But of a number of the names that have been floated, whether we're talking about Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear or Minnesota Governor Tim Walz or the governor of Pennsylvania, we're generally talking about elected officials who have very strong positions in favor of marijuana policy reform or outright legalization. So I do think almost whoever is picked, that we're going to see that Democratic ticket have not just one, but two candidates who have publicly spoken in favor of legalization, which again will be a first in a presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that it's clear that that Vice President Harris supports descheduling. I don't think whoever she picks as vice president is necessarily going to have an impact on the prioritization of those policies as president. And also, really do have to point out that the capabilities of the executive office are pretty limited. Would Robert Kennedy as VP really change things in terms of what a Harris presidency would do versus Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro? I don't think so. I think that that's really purely a question of electability. And I don't even want to consider weighing in on that.
That was a question that was asked earlier. So thanks, Morgan, for that's why I didn't show it. Hey, Ben says cannabis coalition building is key, and NORML's leadership is critical. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ben. Appreciate that very much. Any closing thoughts from either of you before we say goodbye until Friday to our audience?
I think one of the things we haven't touched on in too much detail is the fact that there is this ongoing petition, administrative petition to reschedule cannabis. And I certainly think it is likely that if the Democrats win the White House, that petition will continue to move forward sort of as it has so far. But that there are open-ended implications if we have a Republican administration in the White House. While I don't necessarily think they can bring that rescheduling petition to a full stop, I think it's certainly possible that they could appoint individuals like a new U.S. Attorney General who does not necessarily favor or support reclassifying marijuana, and that could bring this process potentially to a grinding halt, or at least delay it for quite some time. So I do think that is one of the wild cards that people, if this is an issue, if cannabis policy is an issue that is important to you, that needs to be weighed when sort of making this decision about who to vote for in November.
Yeah, I mean, just to pile on top of that, I think that the Biden administration has placed very, very limited pressure on DEA Administrator Ann Milgram to support their preferred position that cannabis be moved to Schedule 3. With a different attorney general and without that presidential pressure to continue the process, I think that DEA, which has made it very, very clear, particularly in their responses to the initial proposed rulemaking for rescheduling, that they do not want to do this, absent the political pressure to at least stay the course and come up with a reasonable result based on the evidence that HHS has provided, that we're going to see this process be stalled or completely scuttled.
that brings us to Christopher's question, which I know is not exactly what we were here to talk about, but since you're both here, why don't you go ahead and weigh in on this? Of course, the public comment period did recently close with regard to rescheduling. And Paul, when do you believe a rule might be made? And want to wager a guess as to what you think it
I'd
might
like
be.
to say I'd like to tell people that I think a rule or a decision is coming soon, but historically that's never been the case. You know, this is an administrative process, and the process is sort of laid out, and historically it's taken many years for this process to come to fruition. Right now, the public comment period is closed, but there's nearly 43 or 44,000 comments that were submitted before the DEA. The DEA is obligated under the regulations to review all of those comments, and there is no timeline written into the statute that provides any sort of deadline as to when DEA needs to go through and review all those comments. Now, keep in mind, you know, historically, when these sort of rulemaking decisions are before DEA, there might be 100 to 500 comments that are submitted. And in some instances, DEA has taken multiple years just to review those few hundred comments. In this case, we're talking about 43,000 comments and a decision that the DEA, as Morgan said, really is only making under duress. So it's my expectation that the agency may try to draw this out as long as it can by simply taking many months or even longer than that to simply go through the comment review process. There's also the possibility that the agency could grant requests for administrative hearings to further discuss this issue, and many different interested parties have requested those hearings. If the agency goes forward and does that, again, that's going to push the timeline back at least several months, if not longer than that. So I hate to be open-ended, but I don't think a decision's coming prior to the election. And even if everything were to go somewhat expeditiously, maybe we could get a decision before the end of the year. And as I mentioned earlier, if we get a Republican administration in office and that decision hasn't been rendered by then, it could be incredibly open-ended after that.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it won't necessarily happen if there's a Republican administration, but I do think that given what we've seen from the DEA, given that they've publicly aligned themselves with individuals and organizations that are actively fighting against legalization and for the maintenance of cannabis as a Schedule I substance under the CSA.
And that have called for hearings.
Yeah, and are definitely publicly aligned with and associating with organizations and individuals that are calling for a delay in the process, period, not just hearings. That, you know, we cannot expect this to happen in any sort of an expeditious manner. I think you're absolutely right, Paul. We're definitely not going to, I mean, it would be amazing if we saw this before the election, but I would be blown away if that actually happened. I'd be equally surprised if it happened before the end of the year.
Wow. Well, thank you, both of you, for not only talking about the presidential candidates and their positions on cannabis policy, but quickly touching on the rescheduling process that's potentially underway right now. That's always a very popular topic here on Live with NORML. Everyone, let's say goodbye to Morgan and to Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now it's time for us all to say goodbye. But before we do, go ahead and take a quick second to hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live. I hope you enjoyed this. I know I did, so much so that we're going to do it again on Friday at 4 o'clock Eastern. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And as always, I'll see you right back here next time. Bye-bye.